Okay, so today's topic is questions. Now, questions is one of the most important tools that we have in order to communicate with people, and we're going to look at why that is the case. So I think this really nails a lot of what's going on in today's world. So the two words information and communication are often used interchangeably, but they signify quite different things. So information is really given out, but communication is getting through. And I think that really summarizes what we focus on here. It's not the information really is producing more force, but what we're focusing on is what is the resistance? How do we navigate someone's resistance to actually communicate? So first, I also think we need to acknowledge ourselves. We are probably living in the most intense times in history. We need to acknowledge that. The fact that we're still functioning is a plus. And in fact, most of us are working on solutions and trying to reach people. And that's really, in the current times, I think that really has to be lauded. What we're facing is completely unfair. To be kind to ourselves, the fact that we are going completely out of our way to take into considerations that the other person might be, rude, they might be completely irrational, illogical, and that's unfair. But would you swap places? Okay. Under no circumstances would you want to be in what we would describe as unaware of what we think is the case. Okay, so a few useful videos to watch by this video. This is more for those watching online. So you really would want to watch How We Absorb Information module, The Hotel of Knowledge, Setting the Scene Part 1. And a few important points for today is really the elusive obvious. So what is the most important commodity we have? And we often overlook this. And of course, we'll go on to that in a moment, what that is. But a lot of people ask me, I enter into a conversation and then, before it's even started, it goes wrong. And I think most people don't realize that people will orientate themselves to how we see ourselves. This is so important. If we feel like we're doing wrong or we're going to get screamed at, any of those things, all of our posture, our body language, our voice tone, all of these things will reflect that state of mind. I was watching a psychology video a number of years ago, and the guy gave an example where this guy who knew a lot about psychology is standing in a lift. And next to him is this gentleman who's standing there. And he said he was dressed in sort of smart casual, and judging by the office building, he was thinking, right, he's probably, an accountant or a lawyer, but he seemed very, very confident. The lift doors were closed, and a gentleman then ran towards the lift door, sort of put his hand in there, got in. He was dressed very similar, but he was all sort of nervy, and he's like, oh, what do I do? And then he said it out loud, oh, 4th floor, but he hadn't pressed the button, okay? So the other gentleman, who's the smart sort of lawyer type, he sort of looks up, presses number 4 for the gentleman, looks at the gentleman, and then looks back at his paper. And the guy in psychology said, in an instant, this man has dismissed that other person because he didn't have the presence, he didn't have the confidence, he didn't stand in his own power. And that's one of the things where, to just touch on, our mindset is so important. If we want to really reach people, we've got to be so feeling that we are doing it for the right reasons. We're not attached to what we're doing. And I just have some information that's really important for you to see. But if you don't want to see it, that's fine. That makes sense. It's this real calm, relaxed mindset. If we go really intrepid and we're a bit scared, then they're going to sense that. Does that make sense? And a lot of the time when people meet, the conversation has already gone down a dead end. Okay. This is why I say smiling, genuine smiles, all these things. So I think that makes sense, is that we will, and of course, when you look at the Stanford prison experiment, that was an incredible thing where once they played those roles, they literally started acting as that person. Yeah, where the guards would be very rude to the other people, and the inmates took on very much a victim approach. So just be aware of that. So what is the most valuable commodity? It's actually awareness. Okay, where we choose to place our awareness is the most important commodity, and it often gets overlooked. So let's say, how my day is going. where I choose to focus, where I choose to put my attention, my awareness, is the most important thing. If I spend 8 hours with my awareness in Netflix, that's not a great use of my awareness. That makes sense? And that's where, you know, focusing on what's going wrong or focusing on the problems is not going to find us solutions. Yes, we need to know about them, but we need to know where to put our awareness. So we're going to go and look for a slide now, which is really going to show why awareness is so key. So we've got Jane blogs and we've got Joe blogs. And of course, Jane has her perception, okay, which this is the three-dimensional representation. Don't worry about this too much now because we're going to go into details on other videos on this. But it's effectively the map of how Jane sees reality. Now, Joe has a different map, okay? He sees things completely differently because he has different information and he's chose to watch different things. And then we have an event or an info, you know, conversation that will occur. And I think the mistake that most people make is they put their focus on that initially. Now, if Joe and Jane are seeing this event or info from different perspectives, focusing on that, just that thing, is not going to change anything, okay? So what we need to do initially is, where do we put our awareness? Well, what we do on this project is we first put our awareness on ourselves. So I need to learn skillfully how to ask questions. I need to learn knowledge around how Joe sees things. I need to basically manage my mindset. If I go into a conversation, I'm very nervous and I get emotional, my rational brain is going to shut down and I'm not going to be able to access the information I know. So it's all about really balancing that first. Once I do that, I can start to focus on, why does Joe see things the way he sees them? That makes sense? So when I move my focus around, and my focus is very limited, I can say, okay, why does Joe think that anti-vaxxers are bad? And then I can start to question him on that, and I can start to reverse the assumptions. Because if I don't, it really doesn't matter, because that event or info, nothing's going to change about the actual data that we discussed. And obviously you can bring more data in. But, and as I said, we will go into this further in other videos, but really awareness is this commodity that's so precious, and, you know, and there's so much of it going on, that where is the awareness, where is the focus of most people in the country right now, okay? And of course, it's a lot of the time, it's really in this fight or flight response. So within focusing on ourselves, it's reflection and it's mindset management, you know, acquiring skills and knowledge as well. And then when we start to focus on Joe and how he sees things, we go to a deep listening and we can actually then start asking artful questions. Okay, so if we think about how awareness would work on a sort of practical level, so Joe might have loads of things around in his life, but he's focused on XXX, okay? And what happens is that when you focus solely on a single thing, you kind of go into a hypnotic trance. So all these things are over there. But if I ask a question, and it could be completely unrelated to any subject he's thinking about, I could say, have you read the Mindspace document? Okay, I've just asked him a question, okay? But that question has changed his area of focus, okay? So a question, much like stories, are so very powerful because, in fact, you're taking the attention to whatever you suggest it to be, okay? And of course, this is really the skill in asking questions that really will take Joe to a place of awareness where he can actually learn. Now, if you take, and what Cordelia was describing earlier, is when some questions will take people to discomfort, okay? And that's all about this stretch zone, you know, don't stretch people too quickly, but also I look at things like lily pads. So it's, how do I build a bridge so they can get from one concept to the next? And to do that in an ethical way, to show them concrete information, you know, and principles, and walk them through the story. And that's the key thing. But hopefully now you'll start to see why questions can be so very powerful. But not all of them, because it's like we don't learn how to ask good questions. And there's so much data on this that it's quite amazing. So think about this for a question. Why are they so powerful? Okay. So that question really presupposes that questions are so powerful. So in the question, it's a powerful question. So Ken Coleman said, good questions inform, but great questions transform. Okay, and I know that there's various people who will tell you that our lives are literally defined by the stories that we tell ourselves and the questions that we ask. This is why it's really worth investing in how to ask good questions, particularly of ourselves. So where does the meaning, where does the meaning come from? So it's effectively from Latin in its root it's to seek. Yeah, the meaning is found in such words as conquest, inquest, quest, question, request. So it's to seek, and often it will be seeking information, but a lot of the time it can be additional things. So the four powerful uses of questions are really, the first one that we all think is just really the main thing is to obtain information. But it's also to bring a thing into awareness. So a lot of the time people will have the answer, and just asking them the question brings it into their awareness. The fascinating thing is I use this all the time on myself. So I'll be somewhere and I've put my glasses down, and rather than search around blindly for them, I just stand there and I close my eyes and I ask my mind, because I know that my unconscious mind knows where they are, and I say, where are my glasses? And I wait a second or two, and then the picture pops into my mind and my unconscious mind tells me. And this is very fascinating because I use this all the time. When I'm talking to people, I often say to myself, okay, what's the best thing to mention next? Or what's the best question? It makes sense. So your conscious mind, as we said, your awareness is very limited, but your unconscious mind is very, very powerful. So the second use is to bring a thing into awareness. You can also impart information with questions, okay? Because you can ask the question which will bring a thing into existence which the person wasn't aware of. Okay, so then they might ask you questions about that thing. And the fourth one really is to capture attention. So you can really, by a quality of a question, it overlaps with the second thing, but it's really, you can really capture someone's attention with a good question. And when we look at questions, there's really a surface and a deep set of questions, and a lot of questions are really on the surface level. But if you start to go under, so it's really like, what most people see in the conversation around the narrative, when we look at the surface, we really don't get that much information. But when we start to look at the deeper things, what's under the surface, then we start getting a little more answers. And I'm just going to show a couple of questions here, which are going to be not related to the narrative, but how are you? What did you have for dinner, etc. Very surface level questions. But if you start to ask deeper questions, what is the most beautiful thing in the world? What is most important to you? Yeah, how do you maximize your potential? These are much more deeper questions. So effectively, we want to ask ourselves, to really expand and grow, much deeper questions. But also, when we understand the power questions, we can start to ask other people those deeper questions. So now we ask the question, what is it? What is the power of a question? How can we use them in challenging the narrative? So let's just touch on the hotel of knowledge. So the hotel of knowledge we talk about as being that mapping someone's mind in how they see a subject. So this was from a gentleman I spoke to, so he believes there's a serious pandemic, he believes that the PCR test works, he believes and trusts the various institutions, he thinks there's consensus, he thinks the checks and balances and so on. So all these assumptions, all these things that he believes to be true are within his map. Now, if you imagine that this person sees the world this way, anytime you tell him information that differs from how he thinks it is, so to him, this is true. This is this gentleman's truth. The fact that it might not be the absolute truth is different. But you can start to see why he operates the way he does. So the challenge is really, how do we get certain bits of information into his awareness? That's the key. But if we tell him conclusions, that's going to be filtered out. It literally won't exist as far as he is concerned. So we have all these bits of information, and the question is, and it's really our art, is to bring to his awareness that these things exist, okay, and bring them into his awareness in such a way that he does not dismiss them. And since one of the biggest obstacles of that is it's who is saying it is the biggest thing, that if he's labeled you as a conspiracy theorist or an anti-vaxxer, he will actually just delete these from his awareness, okay? So the reason we looked at that is that how do we build our maps? So there's actually 3 filters, and we're just going to touch on these today. And they may seem complex, but in fact, they're relatively simple. And like most things, you only have to look at them 1 or 2 times, and they get simple. And since this is recorded, you can watch this over and over, is that we delete information, we distort information, and we generalize information. And it's for these 3 reasons that Joe sees things differently, because he has different filters. Okay, and this explains why we see such different realities. And since most people's maps now are built from mainstream media and the stories they're told by the government as such, the people that believe in the narrative, they believe it as such because they've been told it, they've not experienced it. And I say it's probably true that most of us here do not watch mainstream media because we worked out that it wasn't telling us the truth in so many instances. So we've basically filtered out, we've deleted most of what they say. That makes sense? And we know they distort information, and we know they generalize information. So we've done the same in response to more information. That makes sense? So the deletion is very interesting. Now, it just happens due to the sheer volume of data coming in. Consciously, we delete what is not in focus. So for example, we've all had this experience, we're in a crowded room, conversations going on everywhere, but we're not listening to them. And then suddenly someone mentions our name and our ears prick up, okay? That's because our unconscious mind literally is scanning for triggers, yeah? And one of the triggers, most important triggers, is our name. But here's the thing, focusing helps us deal with the processing information. But here's the problem, if the deleted information is important, we will have impoverished maps. And of course, you see how most of the people now are deleting anything that doesn't agree with their view of the world, even though that information is getting so overwhelming, it's even becoming ludicrous. It's a house of cards. What you're seeing is they can't delete all of it because so much of it is there now that they're starting to question. And the more that happens, so what you'll find is the people that are really completely at the other end, this sort of willful ignorance, it's just they're very good at deleting things. They're just deleting the information that's coming in. So, I mean, one of the great examples, and I won't spoil it for you, but if you haven't seen the selective awareness test, watch that, because it's a great example of how we delete things. They ask you to focus on something, and because you're focused on something, you miss other things. And what happens is that the whole country has been so focused on one thing that they could have literally bring in 100 laws and they're not being noticed because we have a very limited attention span. It's just not, and we've also got a very limited window of information we can absorb. So the fact that people are spending so much time on games and movies and all that is really taking up precious space in their mind. So the second filter is distort information. So it occurs when we start making assumptions. We imagine how things are. So there's a lot of the time that's where you get this projection from. So we actually fill in the gaps in the information provided. Taking in too much data leaves us overwhelmed. We've touched on this in other things. Really limit your intake of data. You're not going to miss anything important because it's being repeated continuously, and people will share with you. You're in so many groups, if something's very, very key, it will come up. So here's an example of a distortion. So asbestos is safe was a complete distortion of reality. Okay, it was, and it was only banned in 72. But in fact, it was 1898, which they knew that asbestos was dangerous. But because the information that people were exposed to, all the information that showed people it was dangerous was basically deleted from people's awareness, or they deleted it themselves. And once it took literally a threshold concept changing, which was a major court case, suddenly that information is no longer deleted or distorted. It's now in people's awareness, and then people completely change their behaviors. So if someone says you are an anti blah, 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 they are literally distorting reality in their mind because they're painting a caricature that you are probably a person that doesn't care for others, example, when in fact it's quite the opposite. Yeah, it is quite the opposite. But to them, in their reality, that is what they see, and that's why they treat you the way they treat you. So the onus, really, or the control is for us to reverse this assumption. And once you do, you will see a completely different response from people. And in the 5 rules of propaganda, the video in there, we explain how they do that, how they literally disfigure a person's caricature for them to assume that. And the third thing is generalizations. We draw conclusions from life events and park similar experiences into one segment. So, you know, all men are XXX, or, you know, we're making generalizations. They don't always serve us. Certain generalizations that do serve us is basically when you go to a new hotel you've never seen before, and you walk up to the front door, you know, how do you know they're doors? Because you've generalized. You don't have to build your interpretation again. That's why generalizations are very useful. They're useful for moving around in the world, but when there's an example that's not generalized, that's when we get a problem. So they're really just a collection of conclusions we have formed on a subject. Now, some of the greatest success you'll get under challenging the narrative will be challenging a generalization. See, the mind needs only 2 or 3 similar experiences to form generalizations for all those experiences, okay? And we do it all the time. You know, you meet 2 people that believe certain things, and then you just assume everyone does. The generalizations are triggered automatically when we face those, you know, similar kinds of situations unconsciously, and then it drives how we respond. So the reason that most people are absolutely rude and abusive to anyone challenging the narrative, because they think that anyone challenging the narrative is basically an anti-vaxxer. You see, that's the black and white thinking that's there. They don't think, oh, this is an expert that cares about freedoms or scientists. They just label them with a generalization. So all XXX are safe is a typical example of a generalization where you can really challenge it. So hopefully now, and of course, what you're going to have is obviously there's a lot of information we just went through. There's a lot of absorption that's going to go on. But to just think about, when I ask a question, what is it that I want my question to do? And you only have to do that for a little while consciously, and then you'll unconsciously ask the right questions. So a number of people said, oh, you know, how do you know the right question? I said, because I practiced asking the wrong ones. You know, I write down the questions, I ask it, I see what the response is, and then I build generalizations about which questions are good. So if we think about this again, so really, if I'm asking a question exactly on the info, that's going to be useful at certain points, but I literally want to start questioning how Joe sees me. Okay, what does he think I am? What does he think about the assumptions that he's made about me? And then I can ask him what the assumptions he makes about himself. That makes sense? So I can really work at the high levels. So in this, the questions that we ask at the higher levels will get the most effect. So the perceptions that Jane and Joe have made about each other is that they're in opposition. Okay, but if we ask them why they believe what they believe, it will usually be a positive thing, and it will usually be the same. And it's when you start asking questions at this level, or making statements at this level, that's when you start to see collaboration and connection. Okay, and there's a lot on this purpose really is someone's group identity. So, but don't worry about the complexity in this model. It will come to you quite easily at some point in the future. So when we think about this question, you're an anti-XXX, when someone makes a statement or a question, I've already thought about at deep levels, what are the assumptions this person is making in order for that sentence to make sense? And if you think about this, every time someone says something, you just think about the assumptions, because those are the things, literally, we're swimming in a sea of assumptions we're largely unaware of. If you can point him or her to the assumptions that they're making in a gentle, connected way, you'll see them become aware of what they're doing. So, and it won't always be best pleased about it. And if you can do it in a gentle way. So a lady said to me the other day, as I said, well, just follow the rules, just do as you're told. And of course, obviously, I challenged that with the various examples of when people followed the rules in the past, which was killing people and all sorts of genocide and segregation, etc. And obviously, that's very uncomfortable for her to realize that. That makes sense. So there's really an art to how you challenge someone on this. But the thing is to know what you're challenging. So this is a typical thing. And of course, you need to validate your assumptions. But if someone calls you an anti-vaxxer, okay, the first thing that most people say is, I'm not anti-XXX, okay? Or I'm, you know, or yes, I am, or, you know, all these things. But you're wrong on all these things. But what he's suggesting, or she suggests by saying that, is that they're not an anti-XXX. So by definition, they are mostly pro-XXX. That makes sense? So that's what they're doing by that. So they're also assuming, by the way they've asked it, is that we are wrong, or the person that they're calling anti-XX is wrong. They're assuming that XXX is good. They're assuming that XXX is safe. They're also assuming that they're in opposition to each other. And then, you know, what they've started to do now is actually get quite rude and, you know, you deserve not to have medical treatment, etc., etc. But if you bring their attention to these things, or if, better still, if you can reverse them, then you're going to see them act very differently. That makes sense? So it's not to say, you know, to just get into the argument of the fact. It's to actually start to take their focus or attention to a place where they can inform themselves better. So the biggest shift will be who and why in any conversation, okay? The whats and the wheres and whens, that's really kind of lower importance. But the perception of ourselves and each other is the key thing. So reversing the assumption changes everything. So the most, I'd say probably 99.9% of conversations on this subject are basically two people taking opposing positions and trying to convince the other one. That doesn't work, okay? Because we delete, distort, and generalize information from other groups is to be ignored, okay? So we have to get to the, why do you take that position? Because I care about my friends and my family. Well, I take my position because I care about my friends and family. We're no longer on the opposite side. We have a shared goal, okay? So why do you call me anti-XXX? Do you know what anti-XX is? Do you know that many professors working on XXX, they are pro-XXX, but now they've got concerns? That makes sense. So it's to really reverse that whole assumption that we're on opposite sides. And that really, I think, is the biggest and the best hurdle to overcome. How are very powerful questions also. But if we look at Joe saying you're an anti-XXX, you see where at these levels, we're asking a question either of who, why, how, what, where, and when. The question of who is the key thing, because he has the perception that we're different who's. That makes sense? So that's why you're going to get so many things, because it's higher up the chain. All scientists agree. Now, that's obviously not true, but his information that he's exposed to in the illusion of consensus is that he thinks that all scientists do agree. So how do we bring into his awareness that that's not true? So if there were many that didn't, would you reassess your position? Are you aware of the numerous scientists questioning it? You see, these sorts of questions bring into his awareness something that he made an assumption that wasn't true. Okay, we all need to be XXX'd. Okay, who said that? Okay, why do you think that is the case? How do you know? These are very different to saying, no, we don't. That makes sense? Because if you just challenge his conclusion, he's just going to defend his conclusion. So you're going to have two people meeting, just defending each other's conclusion. A lot of this really is getting the other person to define what they mean by what they're saying. And what you'll find is most people don't know what they mean by they're saying. They are just repeating what they've been told. So by guiding their attention and their focus, you are literally doing them a service of showing them how they are experiencing cognitive dissonance. And more clarity on this one, which we spoke about numerous times, is the illusion of explanatory depth. The person makes a conclusion, but he thinks that there's so much substance behind their conclusion. But when you gently question them, they realize they have no substance to their conclusion in many instances. So when this was actually, because when you notice about the types of questions that people ask, what they had is that the BBC ran an article, is when will you get yours? Okay, now think about that. The when, right, assumes that all the things above that are taken care of. That makes sense? So that's why that's such a powerful language pattern. And of course, parents will know this, you know, when they say to a child, you know, when would you like to do this morning or this afternoon? They've pretty much given them two options, and you know, the child feels like they've only got those to choose from. So in summary, focus is the most valuable commodity. And in fact, what I'll do now is if I can just actually ask Debbie. So Debbie, do you want to just mention, I'll quickly stop sharing and then I'll go on to the summary. So Debbie is actually an NLP practitioner, and you work with this who, where, when model continuously, don't you? Do you want to give
it? Well, when I teach, it's the NLP meta model, and I'd like to chunk up to help people to remember it. So I use Rudyard Kipling, not Rudolph, Rudolph Kipling. I had 6 honest serving men, who, why, what, how, where, and when. And it's a great way to hold that in your imagination. But if you think about it, if you use these questions, they can be a bit interrogative, because the way you speak very softly, David. But if you say, what do you mean by that? How do you know that? It comes across quite harsh. So if you think about putting a softener in front, which NLP, we under the meta model, there's 3 I use a lot of, which is, oh, that's interesting, or I'm curious, or I'm wondering. So, you know, I'm curious, well, what do you think about that? Oh, that's interesting. What specific scientists? Or I'm wondering, how do you know this? Or I'm curious, who said that? Or that's interesting. When did you reach this conclusion? Or I'm curious, where did you find this information? It's a great way to soften things rather than terrorize, which I think I did in a previous time with Cordelia. I straight meta modeled. You know. So if we think of chunking things in simple things of putting the softener and then the who, why, what, how, where, and when, it's a great aid memoir to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Debbie. And of course, the reason that is so, you know, the questions are so powerful, because a lot of the tone of our voice and whatever comes from how we see the other person. So because the divide and conquer has given us so many ways to experience anger, bitterness, etc. about the other person, once in our mindset we deal with that and we realize this person has been fed a bunch of lies, which is why they're acting the way they are. Once we can really, I mean, I talk about like a debating style of fierce compassion. Yeah, so I really want to get there, but I want that person to know that I care for them. And that's when, you know, that's why I soften so much. And it's not an act. It's literally, you've got to be in that person's corner. You've got to realize that they've been so deceived. When you understand where the brain works, it just tends to make sense. And yes, there are people that are willful ignorance and etc. But I think what Debbie saw there is those ways of really softening the question, because people don't like to be falsely asked things. But, you know, so when you get yours, you know, so if you find the question that gets you to the information, but do it in a nice, soft, gentle way, you'll have a real good communication. So as we said, in summary, focus is the valuable commodity, where we choose to spend our attention. I mean, you know, and this is one of the things that we can overlook. You know, we get to the end of the day and we haven't done the things we really wanted to do, because focus is so easily distracted. I mean, I bet you guys, but like, I'm trying to focus on not having 10 tabs open or 5 things going at the same time, because I know I can't focus on them. So it's to choose one thing and really focus on it. questions and stories really guide focus. You know, our life is defined by the stories we're going to tell ourselves and the questions that we ask. You know, because we will always find an answer for a question that we ask. So it's really the quality of the question rather than the answer that's key. The surface and deep elements are key to understand, you know, so if we ask, you know, questions at a surface level, yeah, that's fine. But do we want some deep elements to be understood? And I guess this one really underpins it. And again, with everything, it's just practice. What do you want the question to do? Okay, so once you start to think consciously what you want a question to do, and of course, when we use this, you know, when I was working with athletes with EFT and various other things, you can get so good at questions, at 3-4 questions, and you've got to the problem. That makes sense? It's the power of questions is really, really powerful. So yeah, so just quickly, everything's free. If you're benefiting, and thank you to those that have donated, you can go, actually it's reachingpeople.net. And the videos will be uploaded, again, it's at reachingpeople.net, but they will be uploaded onto the website as all of the course will be. So let's stop sharing. Let's turn the